Okay, perfect. So today with our guests, we will engage in a conversation about the multiplicity of the logistics, charting the different theoretical and methodological approaches. This through a variety of viewpoints in dialogue, social and spatial, quantitative and qualitative, and global and local.
Okay, so thank you, Agostino. Now for some more practical info. So today's seminar is organized in a first part where the guests will make their presentations. Then there will be room for questions and answers from the audience. We invite you to write your question in the chat during the guest presentation. If you prefer, you can also join with video and audio directly at the end of the free presentation. We will read through your questions and facilitate the answers. So we'll be reading them for you. So we can now move on to the first guest. We have Stephen Ramos. Stephen is an urbanist. He teaches at the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. He's a founding editor of New Geographies and an associate editor for Planning Perspectives. His books include Dubai Amplified, The Engineering of a Poor Geography, and Infrastructure, Sustainability and Design. He is an international advisory member for Light and Depth Erasmus for City Futures Initiative. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agostino and Elia. Okay, can people see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Does the presentation remain, or how does it look right now for you?
Now it's not full screen. We can see the PowerPoint interface. Okay, now it's perfect.
But now it's not?
No.
Okay, hang on for 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
Il bello della diretta for Italian listeners.
Yeah.
So yeah, just for more info while we get this sorted, every guest will have about 15 to 20 minutes. And after the 3 guests, we will go into the Q&A.
Okay, can you see at least this? Because unfortunately, I'd like to keep some of my screen to read. Okay. So as long as you're seeing the PowerPoint, are you seeing the text as well, or just the PowerPoint?
We can also see the
notes on
the notes here.
Yeah.
All right, never mind. We'll just go. Thank you all for the invitation today to Agostino, Elia, Niccolò, and Laetitia. So today I want to share some thoughts about the interface between nature and biophysical systems and logistical systems, and share a little bit of my work on these issues. I'm here at the University of Georgia, and Georgia is in the southeast of the United States. So it's a part of the country that has a history of labor importation, I suppose you could call it that, as well as a material extraction and value extraction. So when thinking about logistics is a management of goods across space and time. Logistics manages a product's life cycle, a supply chain, through raw material extraction, assembly, refinement, distribution, consumption, and disposal. Manuel de Landa traces the origins of modern logistics to early 19th century when French and US military developed the perfect interchangeability of component weaponry parts to standardize their transport and assembly over territories of sites to sites of conflict. The move transfers knowledge from the worker's body to the hardware of machines. This is what he calls the logistic rationality, or the degradation of human skill in favor of capital control, out of which Taylorism is born, to separate spatial production from consumption and the necessary coordination of time, commodity movement, and value exchange were codified. The supply chain metaphor conjures naturalized, rational, sequential links, which through the power of technology can now distribute traditional factory floor assembly line functions across the world. But the sites of production and consumption along the supply chain are comprised of a complex play of technology, culture, commerce, distribution, and their respective and constitutive politics, forming territories.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We're always seeing the title slide. Is that normal?
Yes, I'll go forward. You can go.
Yeah.
So as Claire Lister writes, these territories that converge in part dynamically. Thus, the supply chain metaphor fails to fully represent the political, material, environmental, and social complexes of global production and distribution. Supply chain representational failure provides the opportunity for deeper, more nuanced studies of the heterogeneous global logistics practices through careful empirical investigation. Tracking these mercurial shifting geographies through precise ethnographies of how the circulation of goods actually occurs in practice, logistics in action, as Gregson calls them, helps to identify the political complexities of supply chain assemblage and maintenance to better render what appears to be invisible visible, what Janet Stewart refers to as the revelatory sociology of globalization. One of the reasons, this is from William Waters, a lot of text, but I think a lot of the issues or interests in infrastructure and logistics comes out of a frustration with kind of early globalization research in the early 90s, for example, that didn't think much about issues of unevenness and tended to overstate perhaps the reach of globality. So you have these themes that emerged, Collier, Singh, Lobo Guerro, and as well as on these various topics, friction, topology, corridors, sort of thinking about more the operational aspects of these things, and particularly frictions in terms of things like labor, ecology, and politics and social practices within that. I know Agostino has done some work on food logistics, and there's a wonderful book that's just come out from a history professor here called Oceans of Grain, which I encourage people to get. They talk about the black paths in the Ukraine, and of course the Ukraine is on a lot of our minds. Thinking about the traders then called the Chumaki, and what the book refers to are these black paths or trade routes that actually predate those empires that utilized them. So of course the Roman Empire, sort of the importance of grain and sort of the North African grain fields, and how important the emporium were, which are these grain ports that were so important to those empires. But I think what's really interesting about his point is that the trade paths themselves predate those empires that utilized them. So rather than thinking about only imperial interests in that sense, there's almost an autonomy to the trade routes themselves and the knowledge that they produced along those trade routes by those traders. And also topically, a lot of those first plagues and pests happened to be carrying grain across long distances where disease was sometimes fomented. So it's certainly topical and continues today. But what I want to get to here is that in logistics, there's a certain agency within the infrastructure, as well as in popular knowledges generated by workers along those trade infrastructures that I think are important to keep in mind. Also, within thinking about logistics as a field of inquiry in that sense. Of course, trade empires, the beautiful Venice, trade republics that emerged from being able to harness these things, the Hanseatic League in Amsterdam, and this will be important for later parts, and that you see hinterland connectivity in many ways engineered through the canal systems throughout the Netherlands, right? From Amsterdam, but all throughout, gives us an understanding of dredging and geoengineering as an essential part to the smoothing of trade routes, right? And that domestication of nature through infrastructure, which enables logistics to happen in that way. What's often cited, of course, is Napoleon's Russian campaign that we see here in sort of the typical cartographic representation, but then Minard's chart, the figurative chart that really is often referred to as this sort of first logistics mapping or understanding of space, right? So you have, in a way, it's geodata, but processes are explained through various forms that to some degree we can think about it as a represented logistical space in terms of that interpretive or documenting of Napoleon's round trip, right? And in some ways we can think about it as both logistics and what today is called reverse logistics, right? If we're thinking about it as the full trip and what Napoleon did. The train is often cited, as we'll see, in terms of its ability, as I read, to separate consumer from producer, to enable Taylorism and a kind of a technology's ability to separate capital and the ownership of that. Also in terms of its political ability to centralize and underscore the importance of the capital city. I think France is probably the best example, but certainly Spain and other countries come to mind. The United States, not so much. It's more Chicago as the neuralgic center of the train, but anyway, you get the point that there's very much, one can see the connection. And when looking at something like the Gare Saint-Lazare, which is there in the picture, you see the increasing spatial needs of the train at the Gare Saint-Lazare over time, right? So these are the rail lines that progressively occupy that urban space until the 1886 picture, where you have expanded urban space beyond really the ability of the city to confine it, right? So not only do you have this mega logistical infrastructure, it's overwhelming what was then the ability of the city to absorb, right? And so these exurban pressures to areas that will be able to better absorb those things. And we think about big boxes today as potentially doing that as well. But within one of the questions that Agostino and Elia referred to is the metropolitan ability to absorb, or how does this change? And the Parisian train example of the 19th century, I think is an interesting one in that sense, but we can get back to that. And to the military aspects, which the Landa underscores, you see the war and of course this sort of spatial understanding of war at a global level with these flows that required deployment of armament and troops and these sorts of things. So it's clear that the world is sort of reimagined or reconstructed along military deployment, then defense, and certainly that kind of precedes or leads into the bipolar Cold War framings of world in that sense. But we go, importantly, after World War II, as Deborah Cowan and her works discuss, you move from this point, this military aspect of logistics, to where firms and security of nations are led by these concerns, right? So the geopolitics of borders and security are changed in this way, certainly in terms of thinking about the militarization of trade routes in that way, but also her argument that social and political forms are premised on the territory and ontology of national space. Again, that's even though we seem to have this sort of retrenchment of nationalistic ideals, there's still very much a logistics seamlessness that is aspired toward, or imagined at least in that way. This just to show, perhaps again, back to this idea of disease or pandemic, if you will. So of course, the increased importance of China ports and as a production mode and manufacturing mode, which just sort of underscores what lockdowns will precipitate to potentially a kind of a reordering and perhaps a relocalization of some of these manufacturing needs as scarcity and disruption continue to typify or exemplify. And then, of course, the Suez Canal, the Saint-Simon's understanding of, say, this interconnected, seamless world, and how Lesseps and the Suez Canal in 1869 realized that kind of dream. Of course, this is the more recent, interesting sort of global catch that stopped the world in many ways. In the way, and then this, in a way, I think of this also as, so this is in Afghanistan, and you see people trying to board what is otherwise usually one of these restricted, highly policed areas of airports with several layers of security, where here this just sort of breaks down. And in some way, it's a system that's hacked. And you see, of course, the bomb in the background and what is happening with that. But I think this, too, in its own way, represents, similar to the previous slide, not necessarily failure, but at least failure to what its sort of preliminary program pretends to. And I think we've heard about this before, that infrastructural breakdown or logistics breakdown can be revelatory. And I think in this case, in both cases, they absolutely are. So Brett Nielsen, this is now 10 years old. With Laetitia, we talked about a study that was 10 years old, but this Nielsen just thinks about logistics as power with 5 theses. I think nowadays they're fairly accepted, right? This idea of thinking about ways of being and knowing within capitalism, strategy and tactics, which is all about what Deborah said. Logistics power is political power, but for urbanists and architects, perhaps it's this 4th idea about negotiating heterogeneity in global space and time. Again, back to this idea of coordination. And then also, perhaps particularly the Afghani image, was this idea of logistics producing subjectivity and political subjects as well. So I wasn't able to read, unfortunately, just because the text got a bit messed up. But what I want to do is show some of my work here through what I'm calling a Georgia triptych, right? Sort of the triptych aspect of work of art, to try to begin to understand one discrete area, which is the state of Georgia, through 3 projects that I feel in their own way address relationships between, again, biophysical spheres and logistic spheres, right? So thinking about themes of standardization and unevenness and those tensions, resource value extraction, infrastructure, and then value distribution and dislocation, which I think to some degree gets to some of the questions that were being asked earlier. The first is a project called the deportation, rather logistics of detention here in the United States. The United States migration detention system is the largest in the world. and this again is going back to work by Ethan Blue on his understanding of carceral mobility, thinking particularly about planes. But with my work, I looked at it in terms of bus systems as well. But again, you kind of have a hub spoke spatial formation with migrant detention, right? So icebox, the term uses the acronym for the Immigration Customs Enforcement in the United States. It's linked to box suffix, which just plays on the initials, but it echoes, of course, the short term for cargo containers, which also signifies the climate of detention centers, which are notoriously cold, as for-profit companies seek to cut detention costs and not pay for humane facility climates. The Spanish term for icebox is hieleras, which traditionally refers to refrigerators, but also serves as a common signifier for the detention centers amongst Mexican and Central American communities. Right, so icebox is a serial US architecture of post-Westphalia, where state authority and non-state actors agree to handle and hold bodies for profit. Icebox is a static standard container with coded content filled with people. Icebox territories are comprised of hub and spoke points and lines, which invert orthodox center periphery territorial organization in search of remote, poor areas as sites of detention hubs. Icebox scales move from cellular stasis and isolation through local police stations, holding jails, to hemispheric transborder transportation routes and nodes. Icebox architecture is geographic. Icebox systems are administered in a juridical field that traverses these scales in parallel and consolidates their complex interrelated functionality. So you can see this kind of movement. This is an example of an arrest that's happening of ICE agents, sort of immigration officers, that there's a discussion of rebordering. So in a way, this is in Atlanta, Georgia, which is not along the Mexican border, but these kinds of police moves, the claim is that they reborder where those national boundaries occur, so that it's actually nationwide rather than a physical or geographic line or space in that way. You see the architecture below, a fairly standard institutionalized carceral environment. And here you see red and orange outfits of the detainees, but they're actually color coded depending on the status of the detainees, not unsimilar to the kind of coding that happens in distribution centers in that way. You can see some of the aspects, the geographies stripped of their ecological origin and sort of minimalized in that way. You can see also this kind of stacking, which again, this is a dehumanized compartmentalization of those spaces, right? This gives you a plan of, you see almost a modular, one thinks of company towns and the functionality of it. And here you can think, the dimensions are not unsimilar to that of a container box where detainees are held in that way. And then of course, surveillance is a key part of that as well. There are now cases where the hotel chains rent rooms from ICE as for ancillary detention use. With an increase in immigrant policing, this may continue into a kaleidoscope of spatial forms and architectures as nodes in the detention network, right? So similar to drayage yards that sell off-site storage for containers and freight shipment at nearby sites for cheaper than port sites, one can begin to imagine private competition for holding centers as future pretenders to the ICE budget. And that's actually already really happening. There's a lot of examples of hotels that are being rented for these purposes, as well as the tragic aspect of children through kindergarten or childcare groups who are being paid for child immigrant detention possibilities in that way. So it is the subjugation of immigrant bodies towards capital value generation, because it's the for-profit companies are paid for these detention centers and what it is they're doing in. So we can get into that more perhaps afterward. The second project of the triptych is biomass logistics, the missed history and socio-technical imaginary and transatlantic wood pellet assemblage. Use this Bob Dylan quote, if you let me be in, if I'll let you be in my dream, if I can be in your dream, right? So in many ways, this idea of the socio-logistics, rather the socio-technical imaginary of energy transition is very important to the kind of operationalization of this logistics process, right, in that way. So what I call myth history is certainly this kind of resource abundance of the Southeast, particularly in lumber. This was an idealized rendering by the British just before Georgia is settled in the 1730s. So again, this imagination of indigeneity and resource opulence for extraction in that way. Subsequently, the railroads in the Southeast helped to articulate these resource extraction networks with cotton, but also with lumber for this particular point. And then also a lot of the lumber that's generated here for biomass comes from plantings that had happened, particularly for the paper, pulp and paper industry. There's just some examples of some of those forest areas and plantations and the way they move across spaces to get to port facilities, right? So this, you have trucks full of the lumber that then move to processing plants to create these wood pellets, which are essentially packaged sawdust. But you have issues, well, when thinking about spatial issues or planning issues, you have trucks going through small towns, causing road damage that local towns aren't able to pay for, right? So you do get a private logistics industry grafted onto the public sphere, right? So again, sort of negating this idea of invisibility or seamlessness. They're actually do leave footprints in terms of labor, in terms of municipal budgeting, in terms of ecologies in that way as well. But you also see the intermodality there with trains being used to go from the plants to their final destinations. And then this just a kind of a graphic that shows the moving of nature essentially over to Europe, where it can be either used in wood pellet stoves in people's houses or for larger heating and electricity domestic industrial use or utility use in that way. But this just showing some of the architecture of those ports, the intermodality, the specialized containers, warehouses that are needed because of the combustibility of the wood pellets, right? Sort of, again, moving away, thinking more about materiality as opposed to kind of this idealized container shipping box, which would somehow tries to render materiality sort of irrelevant. I think that's one of the interesting things about the biomass tracking of it. But so it moves mostly from, you really do, it is based on patterns of international uneven development and resource extraction from the Southeast of the United States to the industrial Northwest of Europe in that way, right? And then goes to these various ports where they too have specialized ports, this in Rotterdam, and then also throughout Europe in that way. So it's this industrialization of nature under the pretense of energy transition, but in fact is actually pretty carbon heavy in terms of its movement. So again, the energy transition imaginary of seamlessness and no carbon neutrality is suspect. And I think that's now becoming more of an issue in the way people are understanding this kind of nature transfer. The final project I'll look at is one that was just completed, which is the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project. The Savannah Harbor is the third largest in the country after New York and Los Angeles. It's a small town that houses a big harbor. Some ways it's like Rotterdam in that way, but even smaller actually. So with the advent of post-Panamax ships, the depth of the Savannah River, because it's an upriver port, is being dredged from 42 feet to 47 feet, right? With the Panama Canal expansion that happened fairly recently, that would allow Pacific manufacturing to come to Atlantic ports, this expanded Panamax ship size and economies of scale for shippers to be able to move with larger ships. So this precipitated port dredging at every Atlantic and Gulf Coast port and cut to compete for that new traffic. Right, and the competition was based on access to Class 1 railroad service, as well as distance from nearest interstates. So Savannah did quite well in this because it had both. But you see, this is sort of the city and the town with this mass ship right next to it and running through it, our own sort of little Bosphorus, as I like to say. But the modeling of the river, this kind of geographic domestication, I think, it goes back to the 1950s, and this was a hull where they literally created, or rather recreated at a smaller scale, the entire delta estuarian ecosystem. And thought about then how dredging would impact that. But of course, the dredging moved much faster than the modeling capabilities. But so this gives you an idea of how long the dredging was. It's 32 miles, which something like, what is that, about 50 kilometers, going from 42 feet to 47 feet. So if that's a 5-foot difference, so a little less than 2 meters, right? So, but that's earth, that we're talking about, that amount of earth that's being dredged, right? This kind of geoengineering, wherein literally, if you want to think of it this way, it's capitalism moving the earth to that extent, right? To the power of it and what it's actually doing in the name of logistics movements and what could be called smoothing. Again, gets back to, in many ways, this kind of representational failure. Smooth and seamlessness are one thing, but this is, again, we're getting close to 50 kilometers of nearly 2 meters of earth needing to be dredged continually to maintain these logistics aspirations. These are just sort of the warehouses, right, which the distribution centers that are around the port terminal, which is right there, and that's the river. The landscape of logistics that Charles Waldheim and Alan Berger have looked into. It's and then it has a smaller airport there, but again, your issues of intermodality there. These one of the reasons why it took so long is that there were several environmental lawsuits that took almost 20 years to resolve, but these included species, the impact on species living there, as well as wetlands and various numbers of environmental impacts that the port paid to mitigate. But even though it's taken 20 years to finish with an understanding of its deep ecological impacts, they're already starting to plan what the next dredging is going to look like. So one wonders how often these kinds of environmental impact statements can be paid for in that way, or again, how we think of value in that way.
Stephen?
Yeah.
Thank you. We need to interrupt you just because of time.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you want to finish in 2-3 minutes, could be amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, okay. This again, forgive, I don't want to, I really don't have that much more actually. But this just finally also this idea of storm surge and hurricane vulnerability and certainly sea level rise are also issues for these kinds of port interventions and ecological interventions to keep in mind. And then this only showing that there's the truck traffic that's happening because of the port also has social impacts in terms of how it's impacting communities where they have to, where what were owned houses become rented houses, become abandoned houses because of that truck traffic influence. So let me see. Yeah, I think I look forward to the discussion with everyone and to hear others' presentations. But again, in putting these together and thinking of logistics, it's mostly trying to think of how nature is manicured, curated, radically altered in the name of logistics, and how biology and bodies are both constituted and reconstituted within those systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation. It was full of topics and issues and questions. So I think there will be a lot of materials to speak about in the end of the day. So now we are going quite fast to the second guest. It is Laetitia Dablanc. She's an urban planner and professor at the Université Gustave Eiffel in Paris, where she heads the logistics city share. She leads the Young Initiative of the World Conference and Transport Research Society, and she is member of the research network Metropolitan. Her areas of research have faced transportation, logistics, real estate, logistics, and the environment, and special issues in logistics. She holds a PhD in transportation planning from Ecole des Ponts Paris Tech and a Master of Science in City and Regional Planning from Cornell University. So thank you again, Laetitia, to be with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agostino. Thank you, Elia, for this invitation. I will present to you a few of our works. I'm talking from the chair Logistics City. We look at warehouses, innovations, and new trends in e-commerce and impact on city logistics and mobility. And I just want to point out that we have a lot of results available online. And we also have an observatory of e-commerce mobility. So everything is online. Introduction of the topic, of course, we have been seeing with Stephen that there are new logistic landscapes, especially in large cities. And what we want to do from the chair is to put some numbers into that and to try to identify some connections between the urban forms of the large cities and the location of the warehousing. So we have actually a sort of big data set with 74 cities around the world. We used case studies from the literature. Some of them we did ourselves, some of them we're using from other colleagues. We put all this together and we identified 17 indicators for each of these major metropolitan areas. Most of them are either regarding warehouses or socioeconomic indicators of the cities. And then we're trying to make connections between all these indicators. So these relationships between the urban forms and logistics are multiple. We have about 10 laws, in a way, between urban forms and logistics. I just want to show you two of these 10 major results. One, and it's very counterintuitive, is that the larger the city, the higher the number of warehouses per capita. And we didn't expect that result, right? So there's a sort of clustering, polarization of warehouses into the very big cities around the world. And it doesn't make sense in terms of the cost of land. So it is counterintuitive, but it is happening, and it has been happening for 20 years now. And the second result I will show you is that there's logistic sprawl happening in most of these cases. I will define logistic sprawl a little bit earlier. So lots of warehouses in the big cities, and easy number to remember for the Paris metropolitan area, it means 1,000 warehouses. I'm talking about the big ones, over 5,000 square meters. The trend of the increase in the number of warehouses and also their size is, you can see it from the figure on the right. You have Paris and you have the whole France. So basically the message is that there's lots of warehouses and more, and they are concentrating in the big cities. Same everywhere else. This is a map we just made, just Amazon warehouses, and that's from Washington, DC to New York City. And it's just showing where they locate. The big ones in black, the blue ones in, the small ones in blue, they both locate either in peripheral areas or in the very central areas today. That's a new market. But the message is there are many more of these warehouses today than 20 years ago, than 10 years ago, than 5 years ago. And the COVID pandemic has just increased the trend. So how to explain this concentration in the larger cities? Faster economic growth in mega regions and in big cities, larger consumer market, important for all the e-commerce consumption, of course. But very key explaining factors too that are not as much discussed are the large and diverse workforce. It's very important for this industry today to find workforce, including in computer science, for example, to manage the new warehouses. And of course, nodes of transport infrastructure. Some of these big cities are gateway cities for the whole region, the whole country. So it includes a lot of warehouses that are not used for the local market, but are used as hubs for the whole region. And another reason is an interesting one. It's more closely related to the way the logistics real estate industry is changing. There's a lot of outsourcing of logistic real estate investments today from logistic providers, from big distributing companies. They don't make the choices themselves in terms of where to locate the logistics facilities. They leave that to specialized developers now. And these global developers like Prologis or Goodman actually prefer to locate warehouses in the big cities, because that's where the potential clients will be easy to find if one of their clients leaves the facility. So it helps the market in terms of the rental of warehousing facilities. It's probably a very important piece of the explanation. The second result I wanted to show you is about logistics sprawl. So that's basically, we're looking at that by using a very simple indicator, which is the change in the average distance to their barycenter of all the warehouses. Basically, it means that the warehouses are decentralizing from the center of the metropolitan areas to the suburban and the peripheral areas. So we have calculated these indicators for all the case studies I showed you on the map. And that's also what the type of maps we draw. That's from Los Angeles. That's an old map I did 10 years ago, but it really shows this extension, the spatial extension of the warehouses. That's the case of Los Angeles. So we have all the maps for all the 74 cities. A new trend is that these warehouses are not using as much land footprint as before. It's a very recent trend, but we see more and more warehouses built vertically. So for example, and that's one of the largest warehouses in the world, that's an Amazon center in Delaware. Look at the footprint of this warehouse from the sky, it doesn't look like the biggest warehouse in the world because there are 5 stories. So that's a very new way of building this infrastructure, at least for Europe and the Americas. Asian cities had already a very big tradition of vertical development. A few things to conclude that presentation is a new methodology. We're trying to organize all these calculations on the location of warehouses. So we are trying more automated data collection. We want to save our time and our budget, so we are trying new ways, and we are looking at these new ways in comparison with the old ways of using more detailed databases. So that's just one example of what we recently did. We took OpenStreetMap to identify urban and suburban areas just by taking the points of interest of OpenStreetMap. And it actually was quite satisfying. It's a nice result. That's the city of the region of Paris I'm showing you here. The green is urban areas, the orange is more peripheral areas, and it did work with the regular statistical data set that we used before. And it's easier, it goes quicker. And the second database we used in an automated way was to look at real estate market sites to rent warehouses. So we just use an automated collection of all the prices of these warehouses, the rental prices. And it actually generated quite a good approximation of what we wanted to show, which was the differential in rental prices in urban versus suburban areas for warehousing. So it led us to some of these results about rental prices all over the world for warehousing and comparison between urban forms, the density of cities, and logistics sprawls and rental prices, just an example. And my second little piece of information in my conclusion is the more micro research we do on warehousing and the way warehousing are accommodated in cities. So more of a micro approach, not a macro approach using these big data computations. So the micro approach is shown here. One of our research is, it was a student who did a very interesting piece on the way a wealthy part of Paris, these are the cities of Issy and Boulogne, you can see them here, that's a very wealthy part of Paris. The way they are actually distributed for all the parcels that they consume, businesses and people living in these wealthy cities west of Paris, they are being served by warehouses that are outside of the cities that are using the parcels, that are consuming the parcels. Okay, so we just wanted to show how different the location of warehouses was when you look at the specific cities and their socioeconomic status. So in that case, there's absolutely no warehouse located in the cities that are being served. And the warehouses that are serving them are very far away, actually generating a lot of truck traffic just to go into these 2 cities. So this is the sort of work we do by looking at very specific places. And last couple of pictures, in terms of looking at the micro reality of warehousing, we do sort of photographic walks into cities, and we try to understand the place. So that's an example from an Amazon urban center in Brooklyn. We were there a month ago, and we were just talking with people who are actually making the deliveries from that Brooklyn Amazon urban center. It's a small warehouse, and all of the drivers that are collecting the shipments and are delivering the shipments within an area, let's say 6-10 miles around this warehouse, are Amazon Flex drivers. So these are individuals like you and me, just getting into the Amazon Flex app and making the delivery. So just by walking around the streets and talking with the people making the job, we actually can draw some conclusions about the way these new last mile deliveries are being made. New formats in urban warehouses also are very striking. Again, that's things we look at from talking with developers, talking with city administrations, and making our urban walks. Our new architecture for urban logistics centers that are more vertical, mixed use, temporary, lots of use of spaces waiting for a development permit, for example, or sharing of space. During the day, it's logistics. During the night, it could be the organization of the parking of the buses for the Paris Transport Authority, for example. So lots of new imagination in terms of where to locate these new small micro hubs for logistics. And new urban formats now are also coming from the big players. So these mainstream developers I told you about before, the companies like Prologis, Goodman, they used to do warehouses only in the suburban areas. Now they are interested in the urban market. So these are typical new advertisement for the new sort of big urban warehouses within city centers. I'm talking here about warehousing facilities that will be implemented in the very center of the city of Paris, so the very center of the Paris region. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Laetitia. We have a couple of questions that we will address after the three presentations. And we can now move on to our third guest.
Yeah, our third guest is Niccolò Cuppini. Niccolò is a lecturer at the University of Applied Science and Arts of Southern Switzerland. His researches are oriented towards a transdisciplinary approach with the urban studies and the history of political doctrines fields. Niccolò is involved in many international research projects on logistics and urban transformation, and is part of the research group IntoTheBlackBox. Thank you, Niccolò, to be part of these talks, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me today. I hope you can see the presentation. As previously mentioned by Agostino, the research I developed in logistics is part of this collective research project named IntoTheBlackBox. Our project aims to elaborate a transdisciplinary approach on logistics, but to be more precise, I can say that for us, the challenge is to use logistics as a lens for critically investigating our present. We see logistics as a specific operation of capital, but at the same time, we think that logistics is a logic that is pushing forward a complete reconfiguration of our contemporary economies. Another thing I want to say for introducing our approach is that for us, logistics is the main vector that made possible one of the most impressive transformation of contemporary economies, that is the shift from production to circulation as the main focus and the main vector that is leading the contemporary capitalist development. So this shift from circulation to from production to circulation has many quite important implications. And another point that characterizes our approach is that we want to emphasize the political aspects endowed in these transformations. So just to give you an example, if you look at the mainstream but also critical literature on logistics, one of the main topos in this literature is the genealogical reconstruction of the logistics, the genealogies that starts from the so-called logistics revolution in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century. However, for us, it's quite important to turn upside down this perspective, because the logistics revolution is usually narrated as a technical transformation of the previous economic model, the Fordist model, if you want, while within IntoTheBlackBox, we are talking about a logistics counter revolution, because for us, logistics has been one of the crucial factors that made possible to dismantle the power of the organized working class within the factory. Logistics made possible to reshape the configuration of production, to dismantle again the concentration within the factories, and to redesign the lines of circulation all around the metropolis and all around the world. Another thing I want to say is that IntoTheBlackBox was born as a research project thanks to the co-research that all of us did in Italy, northern Italy, almost 10 years ago, during a quite powerful cycle of struggles within the logistics sector. So for us, this is the starting point, this cycle of logistics struggles that meant basically blockage and strikes within and also all around the logistical warehouses in again northern Italy, so Milan, Bologna, Veneto, and so on and so forth. So these struggles were quite inspiring for us because their characteristics were quite peculiar. In that period, we were in the first wave of the global crisis. All the economic sectors were in crisis, while logistics was a really growing sector. So this appeared as a contradiction. A second element is that logistics strikes were played mostly by a migrant workforce, and there were many resonances in 2011 from these specific strikes and struggles and the wave of insurrections that took place all around the world. So just to give you an example, in a strike in Piacenza, the protesters were singing, "Here is our Tahrir Square," recalling the Egyptian revolution. So for us, that specific struggle opened up a sort of a new world, and from then we started to investigate also in terms of academic research logistics. One of the most important plays of these struggles were the Interporto of Bologna, that is the main logistical hub of the region. So you can see here the global, or at least European and Asian connections that the Interport of Bologna makes possible. It's quite remarkable to say that the Interport of Bologna was built during the 80s by the municipal and the regional government. And in terms of architecture, the funny thing is that it represented the quite typical neoliberal idea of planning places of production at that time, because there is only one access to the whole Interporto space. This means that for the strikes today is quite easy to block the whole structure, because you need to block only one place. Because again, during the 80s, the idea of the if you want class struggle seemed overcome, but history has taken different trajectories. So Interporto became a quite crucial node for counter-logistical practices, because workers could play their positional power in blocking all these flows. So a small block meant a wave of blockings all around the supply chain. And last thing I want to say about this is that this public project of concentrating logistical operations quite far from the city center of Bologna, we can say that failed, this project, because on one hand, the neoliberal organization of all the territorial space of Bologna didn't follow this attempt to concentrate all the logistical warehouses within this hub. We assisted to a proliferation of logistical warehouses all around the Bologna's territory. So this attempt to concentrate didn't really work. However, and this is the second part of my today's presentation, what is important for me is to emphasize the urban logic that plays beyond these logistical operations. And I want to say something about the logistics genealogy that also Stefan somehow already mentioned. It's quite consolidated within logistics literature, that there are two main streams, logistical genealogical streams. On one hand, the military genealogy, that means that modern logistics born as a way for supplying the armies of the modern states during the 18th and 19th century. So this need to cartography the territory for moving the troops, this need to sustain the troops all around these new spaces for war in Europe. And there is a second genealogical line, that is that of slave trade. There are some critical scholars like Stefano Harney and Fred Moten who emphasized a lot these genealogical traces of logistics that born for moving this quite complex commodity that were the slaves. However, my point is that we need also to stress that logistics has a profound urban genealogy. If you look at the Civitates Orbis Terrarum, that is one of the first attempts to map cities all around the world in the 18th century, all the urban representation that are contained in this book, like these are two examples, you can see how the idea of logistics and of representing urban logistics was strictly connected to urban representation. The second example I want to mention is the quite famous frontispiece of the Thomas Hobbes Leviathan, that maybe you know that book. It's quite the most important book for political theory that established the very concept of the modern state. And if you see at that frontispice, you see that an empty city is represented, meaning that people were evacuated from the city and put within the body of the Leviathan, of the sovereign. So the very idea of the modern state is to take away the power that city used to have before modern state, and to reorganize the civitas and the urbs in different ways. However, what happened is that in 1848, you can see some pictures from the insurrections that occurred in many European cities at that time. The city came back as a locus of the political, so the city again became a battlefield, again became a place of insurrection, and as a reaction to that episodes started one of the most famous plan of urban transformation, the becoming metropolis of the city. So I'm here referring to Haussmann works in Paris, but we can also think about what Ildefonse Cerdà did in Barcelona. However, again, my point is that if we see through logistics, we can contribute to the attempt that recent urban studies are pointing to. That means to dismantle the binary through which we were accustomed to look at city and countryside, to the binary that we are accustomed to do the so-called criticism. So my point is that if we see these quite canonical example in urban studies of urban transformations, we need to combine this image of the intense urban transformations within the city cores with this kind of representation. So in the same years in which Haussmann were transforming Paris, the French regime were planning the European infrastructure. So I think that, and the infrastructure of the territory was the same, the project of infrastructurizing the territory was the same of transforming the cities as hubs for this complex circulating model. So today, the contemporary theories of planetary urbanization are somehow the iconic representation of what I really fastly tried to say, that if we see the urban through logistics, we can think the urban as a sort of circulatory model, and this is a way for reframing the whole approach through which we usually frame urban studies. To conclude, I want to spend a few words on the current tendencies that are somehow disrupting logistics. So here you can see three pictures. One is that of an Amazon warehouse. The other one is that of the already presented case of the Suez Canal blockage. And the third one is about military logistics in Ukraine. So these three factors, Amazon meaning the digitalization of logistics, meaning the huge investment of capitals and technology in logistics. The second aspect is about the deep impact of that the pandemic had on global supply chain, and the fourth one is the war in Ukraine, and more generally quite complex cascade effects that it has having all around the logistical supply chains in Europe and beyond. So I think that we are living in a quite complex vortex of transformation in which through which logistics will be really transformed in the next few years. So to really conclude, my point is that if we see at logistical history, logistical present, and logistical future through an urban lens, we can somehow elaborate a new paradigm for framing urban studies and to keep together the top-down transformations that logistics is producing, but at the same time, the struggles, the frictions, the resistances that occur in logistical operations. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Niccolò. So we would like to thank all three guests for their presentation. Just to recap, we had first Stephen with his presentation on logistics and nature and the three cases. And then we went through Laetitia's work on sprawl, more quantitative work, and we just ended with Niccolò. That's a lot of very different insights, like very, very interesting in each one in their own terms. Now there is some room for questions. We already had one from the chat that we didn't have the time to address. I can repeat it for the audience. So Federica was asking in the context of logistics sprawl in suburban areas, she was noting that we should consider the spatial impacts of warehouses localization, so maybe locational choice in terms of infrastructure development. So Laetitia, you have some time to address this now.
I understood Federica's question as transport, related to transport infrastructure, and I think it's a very good point. All these warehouses locating in logistics parks or isolated in economic activity zones put pressure and demand for highways and highway in connection highway nodes. It does require authorities then to respond to that need. So I think it's something that the regional authorities or the metropolitan authorities do not take into account enough when they say yes to a building permit for a warehouse, the impact, because it generates truck miles, truck kilometers locally and on the region. It should be taken into account before giving a building permit. And the location should take all these transport impacts into account, and they do not at the moment.
Thank you, Laetitia. There are questions from the audience. Please open your microphone and.
I was also wondering about something that Stephen mentioned. You showed example of actually abandoned houses. I mean that's extreme, but how does that happen in Georgia? So just neighborhoods are abandoned because there's too much traffic.
Yes. I think it's actually not uncommon. So in last mile spatial configurations, even though trucks are channeled through certain roads, and there are signs that say that trucks aren't allowed to go into neighborhoods, the trucks, because of time pressure, risk the police fines to go through those neighborhoods anyway. And so people get frustrated with that in terms of quality of life, air quality, and these kinds of things. So what the first phase is, okay, renting them so that's no longer their primary residence if they can, to the point where it's degraded and people just abandon the neighborhood because it essentially becomes an ancillary port route. So the port border as this kind of zone of exception, as this kind of spatially restricted area. And when thinking about last mile, I think it's more of a transition area as well, and with these kind of economic functional spatial demands. And so that's just an example of how increased truck traffic, in many ways based on increased container ship size, and the kind of the pulsar effect of needing to unload those ships within a certain time frame, takes on a social impact in terms of neighborhood composition and displacement.
Thank you. We had another question from the chat. Alberto, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yes, thank you, Elia and Agostino, for organizing this. I wanted to ask my question to Laetitia Dablanc. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, I thought it's very interesting because it finally puts some numbers on the question. Together with Elia, we are leading a research on the logistical territories of northern Italy, and across our interviews, even public actors seem to believe in the spatial expansion of logistics, but nobody knows the dimension of this kind of stuff, and quantitative data sets are hardly available in our region, so we are struggling with this aspect, and I think we learned a lot from your presentation, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a question similar to that of Federica. Assuming that logistics is a driving agent of urbanization, as I think we all share in this conversation, have you considered the possibility of giving a dimension to certain externalities that emerge from the localization of these warehouses, not necessarily positive, but also negative ones? For example, introducing forms of uneven urban development, like rent differentials. Have you seen a variation in, have you ventured into seeing variations in housing prices, or a decrease in the provision of general services, or an increase? I'm wondering if you have observed the urban dimension, the urban effects of logistics beyond logistics per se. I think it would be very interesting to see that.
Thank you, Alberto. We look at carbon footprint assessments, especially because it generates more truck kilometers. So we do calculate that. And we also look at the way it changes work, status of contracts, the way workers go to the warehouse, the lack of mobility for some of them, because young people don't have so much driving licenses, for example. So we do look qualitatively and quantitatively at these two dimensions. Nothing more from the topics you identified, but these are good points too.
Thank you, Laetitia. I have another question connecting also to Niccolò. Niccolò, you were talking about the sort of centralization of the Interporto, and then how this became a disadvantage, and so how warehouses are actually sprawling around. So I was wondering, if I understood correctly, do you think there was a strategy, a political strategy behind this? And also connecting to this, do you think this sprawl, this locational choice, and that's also a question for Laetitia maybe, is driven towards, for example, disadvantaged areas, so maybe cheap workforce can be found?
Yeah, my point is that the public power, meaning local, regional administrations, tried to concentrate logistical flows to govern them and to plan the urban expansion of the city in, again, a sort of ordered way. However, the like private interest in developing logistical hubs, logistical warehouses, and so on and so forth, didn't somehow accepted this, didn't accept these public attempts to govern and to concentrate the flows. So they were moved by the ratio of profit, of course. So the cheaper the territories for constructing new warehouses, the best for them to move there. So there was this attempt to concentrate, but it failed due to this private interest in the moving somewhere else. Today, if we look at Amazon operations, they are somehow mixing the two logics. So they are producing new centralities, but at the same time they are disseminating small warehouses all around. So they are somehow a private state company at play. And you are absolutely right in the study we did in logistics in northern Italy and also in France. I can say that the logistical management always study its territorial organization in social terms, meaning that they search for precarious labor pools for building new warehouses. They look at what are the cheapest territories for building new places for their operations. So there is always this search for social benefits for logistical companies. So this is a second lens that we need to use.
What is very interesting, I think, is that later on with the time, the logistic is changing also these categories, these elements that you are finding in some places. Today, I think that what was a common element of all your speech was about the political ability of the logistics and infrastructure to change the space and the time, no? There was Stephen that was speaking about the trucks that was inside the small cities and the impact of this truck. And also Laetitia was speaking about the increasing of the price of the building after that logistics was located there. And for sure, Niccolò was speaking about livelihoods, the strikes, etc. So what I think is interesting was the new paradigm that Niccolò was speaking about, these top-down readings of logistics that is connecting with what Stephen was said about the ability of logistics to negotiate the heterogeneity of, you speak about global space and time, but maybe it's the global space and time and the local space and time. So my question, that maybe is not a question, is a reflection, is this ability, this political ability of the infrastructure to change the place, the local place and the characteristics of the labor market, the building market, the real estate market. How is strong? I mean, we are usually you are used to watch this logistics as something that is very global, no? And it looks to me that in all your speech, the local dimension of the logistics was stronger maybe than the global one. So I don't know if you have some example of the power of the logistics to change some local dynamics that they were considered before, establish new distribution centers, but after they changed after 10 years that the distribution centers were located.
Well, Agostino, I just have one remark about that. You know, there are more than 1,000 municipalities in the Paris region. Some of them, therefore, are very small villages. They have a lot of land available and they turn it into logistics land use. So imagine there's a small mayor just managing a village that is discussing with Amazon or Amazon real estate developer, which is Goodman or Prologis. These are global players. So that's what has been happening. And in some cases, the mayor actually just says, no, they don't want logistics. And in many cases, the mayor says yes, because logistics is interesting because it brings taxes, it brings jobs. So we have tried to do typologies of the behavior of local authorities in the particular case of these very small municipalities in the Paris region. You do have different types of mayors. You have the ones that are entrepreneurs and they want the logistics. You have the ones who don't want the logistics, and you have also all the interaction with the local groups, the local residents. In Amazon, for example, has never been able to locate in the west part of France. They have been trying to locate for a big distribution center in the west by Nantes and other cities like that. There's always been prevention from the local authorities plus the population. So in other parts of France, it went much more smoothly, and the territories want these facilities. They're very different ways of dealing with these big players.
Thank you, Laetitia.
Laetitia's point is very good. Anna Singh, in her book, when she looks at frictions, she uses the phrase niche segregating performances. And she suggests that these aren't obstacles. These aren't sort of local inconvenient obstacles to global networks, but rather adaptive structures, which actually at the end enable performance. So I suppose, I think what that adds is that the complexity of the spatial formations and the local configurations resist easy sort of global versus local categorization. It's a bit of a dance, right? So I think while some of those may be easily identifiable, how those depend on one another and sort of are mutually constitutive politically and economically, I think that's the richness a lot of times of these specific investigations, like what Laetitia and Niccolò are discussing. And I think what I was trying to say at the beginning of my speech, of this idea of if you're operating at a 30,000-foot view of these processes, you miss the complexity, which each case study helps to unpack and complicate in productive ways, I think.
Yeah, it's very, yeah, I totally understand your point of view. And I think that is also connecting what we were saying, Stephen, you were saying in your presentation, that with logistics, you can understand the spaces now, so that you can use the logistics as also tools to try to understand the spaces and the single characteristic that in the contemporary they are framing in a more wider background. So thank you. There are other questions on the chat from the audience. We have a couple of time more to discuss about logistics today. So if not, you have, yeah, of course.
I'm taking up all the time, but really, it's so interesting. I wanted to go back to one of the first points of Stephen's presentation. So you were talking about the relationship between logistics and empires and showing some examples, some historical examples. So I don't know if you're really into the subject, but how do you see this today's explosion of special economic zones? So that's something I'll be studying. So this special sort of extension of free ports that go into the hinterlands, are these the new sort of Venice? Are they serving more global needs? Why are they exploding so much? Why are there so many of them?
I have a colleague who's working on a project about that. I mean, I think it's a rich topic. My engagement with it was for my doctoral dissertation. I looked at Dubai and this aspect of the special zone or the free trade zone is the way they set up a kind of cities within a city framework to think about what other people discussed. But these regulatory or deregulated areas of exception, I mean, it's interesting. It's like planning itself, whereby there's a movement such that those spaces are increasing, and I wonder when it hits that point of inversion. I wonder when these spaces that you're discussing in free trade zones actually take on such a scale. And Laetitia's work is looking at this a little bit in terms of thinking about footprints and going vertical. But if at some point in horizontality in a metropolitan matrix, those exceptional zones become a kind of a standard, just because it does seem that those footprints are expanding. Again, that's more of a longue durée thinking about it, but certainly the richness and the spatial configurations of each particular example, the intermodality, the light processing and assembly that happens in there, whether it's corporate regulatory or managerial frames, doing spatial planning for those, how they interface with larger infrastructural systems, or the public-private mergings within. I mean, it's a very rich topic just to think about the production of new spaces and services, or in interfaces with sort of established political spatial orders. So it's a rich topic. I'm not sure how to get into more details with it, but it seems the fact that you're studying it, I think, is great. I would encourage that. Look into it.
Thank you. So yeah, I don't want to take more of the participants' time. If there are any last remarks from the guests, we welcome them. Otherwise, we can just thank you and close this first talk. Okay. I guess you're. I see Laetitia is nodding, so I take it as a yes. Stephen is thanking us. So before ending, just a few final info.
So
yeah.
the next meeting, as I said in the beginning, it will be on 18th of May at 5 p.m. on Zoom. The topic will be Gender and the City, Perspective from the Global South, and is curated by our two colleagues. So everyone is welcomed, and we are looking forward to see you again in this space of discussion. And thank you very much for everyone to be with us today. And I hope to see you again very soon. on the chat we can, Sophia, that is the organizer from by the next talk, shared now the link for the next meeting. See you next time, and thank you everyone to be with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.